Welcome, everyone. My name is Frieda Nixdorf, and I represent the Work That Reconnects network. So thank you for joining us today for the Webinars and Conversation Cafe series. We're offering a wide range of rich educational and supportive opportunities for our global community of Work That Reconnects facilitators, members, and friends of the network. Our intention here is to strengthen the web of the Work That Reconnects community while continually reaching beyond our current edges to weave deeper connections with others who are contributing to the great turning in diverse and complementary ways. Everyone, today we have with us Richard Heinberg and Sylvia de Blasio for Resilience for the Great Unraveling.
Thank you, Frieda. So we are here today with Richard Heinberg. Richard is a senior fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute and is the author of 14 books, including Power, Limits, and Prospects for Human Survival, along with hundreds of essays and articles, some of which have been appeared in Nature, Wall Street Journal, and the American Prospect. He has lectured on 6 continents and has appeared in numerous environmental documentary films. It's an honor to have you here, Richard. And with that, we're going to go to Richard's first presentation today.
So thank you so much for the kind invitation to be here with you today. And I see we have a nice big group, so hopefully we'll have a very interesting couple of hours. What I'd like to do in my short presentation to start us off is to summarize my most recent book. It's sort of the capstone of my efforts as an environmental writer over the last 30 years or so. And it's a book that takes a big picture perspective on the human situation in the 21st century. My objective in writing the book was not so much to highlight and solve a particular problem, which is what I've done in a number of books previously. It was to step back and look at the whole situation and try to attain some sense of perspective and hopefully even wisdom with regard to, again, the human situation. Now, okay. So the book is organized around 3 questions. The first, how have we, just one species out of millions, become so powerful as to bring the entire planet to the brink of climate chaos and a mass extinction event? The second question, why have we, humans, developed so many ways of oppressing and exploiting one another? We're kind of unique in the world in that sense as a species. And third question, is it possible to change our relationship with power so as to avert ecological catastrophe, etc.? So I chose power as the overall frame of the book because power is really everything. I'll explain. It's good to start with a definition. A physicist would define power as the rate of energy transfer. And it's useful to have that definition in our minds because it defines power in a way that can be measured in watts or horsepower. So just raw energy and the way energy is transferred, that's the most basic way of thinking about power. But when energy is transferred, something happens. And everything we do, in fact, involves energy transfer at some level. So the ability to do something is power. And we speak of power in that sense in ordinary conversation. We speak of the power of flight or the power of speech. But then in English, we use power in 2 broad senses. It's not so much true in other languages. Other languages often have a different word for social power as opposed to physical power, which we've been talking about so far. But in English, we use this one word, and it's actually, I think, very helpful in terms of our understanding if we, pick things apart and look at them carefully. So if power is the ability to do something, social power is the ability to get someone else to do something. And we humans have gotten very good at social power. I'll be talking about that a little bit more as we go on. But there are two kinds of social power. One is horizontal power, where we all just self-organize to accomplish a task together. And the other kind of social power is vertical social power, where I use vertical and horizontal because with vertical, there's somebody at the top of a pyramid of power who can control everybody else at lower levels in the pyramid. And that process is mediated typically by incentives and threats, rewards and punishments. So power in the general sense, as we spoke about it first, is everywhere. It's a thread that ties together everything from astrophysics to cell biology and everything in between. In fact, if you want to understand any system, any organism, any ecosystem, any society, follow the energy or follow the power. One little factoid I picked up on as I was researching the book was that gram for gram, the average organism is 10,000 times as powerful as the sun. That seems crazy on the face of it, but if you do the math, the sun is extremely massive, far more massive than any organism on Earth. And if you do the division, do the long division, you realize that in fact, living things are incredibly powerful. Evolution has enabled organisms on planet Earth to gather energy from their environments. And that, of course, that energy in most cases originates from sunlight, but then it gets channeled through ecosystems and stored by organisms and then used in the process of doing things. So life is pretty amazing in that sense. But we human beings have become really the champions of power on planet Earth. And it was through a fairly long process of biological evolution and then cultural evolution. Biological evolution, how our bodies evolved to be the way they are with hands and thumbs and big brains and so on. But then also cultural evolution, which focused on language and tool making. These are things that are taught. They can change very quickly from one generation to the next. Cultural evolution can happen much faster than biological evolution. So in cultural evolution, we developed the ability to control fire, which enabled us to stay warm at night and ward off predators and change ecosystems and obtain more nutrition from our food. Fire was a huge power boost. Then, of course, tools, the ability to make things that leverage our power, our muscular power, to accomplish more stuff. Like if you can throw a spear, well, that turns out to be a big advantage if you're going after a big animal like a bison or a mastodon. Clothing and language, huge advantage because language enabled us to coordinate our behavior over space and time. And it was language more than anything else that really got cultural evolution going, because tool making and language really went together. Using language, we could teach others how to make tools and make tools that were much more sophisticated. So in hunter-gatherer societies, typically for the most part, horizontal power was the rule. It's not as though nobody was able to tell somebody else what to do ever, but for the most part, within groups, decisions were made communally. But over the last 6,000 years or so, we've evolved culturally vertical social power. And the keys to that evolutionary process were war, grain agriculture, and the development of more complex societies typified by state societies. With agriculture, of course, it was possible to have food surpluses, and then who was in charge of the surplus and who distributed it, who defended it, and so on. All of these things led ultimately to vertical social power. The three tools of vertical social power are good to know: money, weapons, and communication technologies. I call them the power tools. If social power is the ability to get other people to do something, well, money, if you have enough money, you can get other people to do all kinds of things. So economists typically talk about money as if it were just a neutral means of exchange. But in fact, in our daily lives, we all know that power is much more than that. Money, we know that money is much more than that. Money is social power. So these power tools have evolved over the centuries that we've had them. And as they've done so, societies have become larger in scope and more complex, from small kingdoms to big empires. And social scientists who study these complex societies as they evolved over time have found, through statistical analysis, looking at data from hundreds of such societies, that collapse is a normal and predictable feature of complex human societies. We see it again and again and again, and virtually no instances where it hasn't happened. So we get to the modern world, and suddenly something changes dramatically. The scope and speed of the change in the last 200 years has been off the charts compared to anything in previous human history. And it's all attributable really to fossil fuels. Now, before we could use fossil fuels, some things had to happen. We had to have private ownership of natural resources, government protection for investors, and incentives for innovation. The reason we know this is that we did the experiment earlier in history, about 1,000 years ago. The Industrial Revolution almost took off in China. China had lots of coal. They were beginning to mine and use more coal for industrial purposes. They were heating buildings. They were using it for metallurgy. There was a private ownership of land, and there was more and more privatization going on, more and more investment happening, and lots of innovation, lots of new inventions. But the government saw this as being a threat to the hereditary hierarchy, monarchy that was in place. And so they shut it down. And 700 years later, it happens again in Britain. And this time it takes off. It catches hold and takes off. Why so? Well, in Britain, something had happened just a couple of hundred years earlier, the colonial invasion and takeover of indigenous societies around the world, India, Australia, Africa, the Americas, and enormous wealth came into not only Britain, but also France and Spain, Netherlands, as a result of colonization. And this created a new powerful class, a merchant class, that was already challenging the power of the hereditary aristocracy in Europe. So, on this occasion, the hereditary aristocracy was not able to shut down the fossil-fueled industrial upstarts the way it had in China. And it took off, and here we are. And it changed everything. This is what agriculture looked like prior to the fossil-fueled industrial revolution. This is what it looks like today. Formerly, it took 90% of the population to grow enough food for 10% living in cities and specializing as boot makers and soldiers and whatever. Today, you know, with 1% of the population growing all the food for everybody else, what have all those people done? Where are they? They moved to the cities. Over the last decades, the biggest demographic trend has been urbanization, people moving from the countryside to cities everywhere in the world. And they've gotten jobs. Now, this is a little graphic from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Farm jobs as a percentage of total U.S. jobs. And you can see here in 1800, 90% of people were working on farms. But they didn't have jobs. This is a very misleading, the slide is misleadingly titled farm jobs as a percentage of total U.S. jobs, because in 1790, very few people had jobs on the farm or anyplace else. The idea of employment, regular employment for money, was pretty rare. It happened occasionally, but most of those people working on farms were either enslaved persons, kidnapped from Africa, or small landholders, or big plantation owners. So the slide really hides as much as it reveals. Let's see. Here we go. And ultimately, we get the economy. Now, in 1790, nobody was talking about the economy. There were a few economic philosophers in Britain and France who were starting to talk about these kinds of things, but it's really only since fossil fuels that the economy has become a thing that we track and measure using GDP. And this little graphic from Investopedia shows us a typical economist's idea of the economy: producers and consumers. Yeah, well, what else is there? How about the earth, where all this stuff comes from that we use to manufacture things? Or how about, where does all that waste go? There's so much left out. Or how about energy? You know, energy is what makes it all happen. It's not just labor and capital, which is all that most macroeconomists talk about. So the discipline of economics has grown up in this very unusual moment of human history, where we had rapid growth of manufacturing, waste extraction, waste production, resource extraction, so on, and has normalized it. Economics has said, well, this is the natural way that things work. It's normal. And this is, of course, how things will go on forever. As we'll see, it's by no means how things will go on forever. The idea that the economy can grow forever is a perverse one, but we see it absolutely everywhere. Pick up the business pages of any newspaper. I challenge you to find a single article over the course of a year, 2 years, 10 years that challenges the idea of economic growth. But growth always implies a doubling time. At 1% annual growth, any quantity will double in about 70 years. At 2%, it'll double in 35 years. So doubling time is a really important concept to keep in mind whenever thinking about growth. So economists say the economy should grow at about 2 to 3% per year. Well, what is that in terms of doubling time? It's doubling about every 25 years. And that's what we've seen for decades. The global economy has doubled in size about every 25 years. So if it starts off at unit 1, then 25 years later, it's 2, 25 years after that, it's 4, 25 years after that, it's 8. And you can see how things get out of control pretty damn quickly. And yet this is supposed to go on forever? Hang on. But this is what you see when you look at energy in modern industrial society. That period from about 1950, the year I was born, to about 1975, that was the period of the most rapid economic and population expansion in all of human history. And you can see why it happened. That's when oil was coming on, the most versatile and useful of the fossil fuels. And we have never seen anything like it before, and we will probably never see anything like it again. And of course, we use that fossil energy to create more carrying capacity for human beings by growing more food, distributing it from where it was abundant to where it's scarce, by making chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, pharmaceuticals, to enable people to live longer. And here we are, in 1800, 1820, we were 1 billion. Today, 8 billion. So fossil fuels have done a lot for us, but it was really a bargain with the devil. Why? Because fossil fuels, first of all, are finite substances we extract from the Earth's crust and burn once and for all. They won't last forever. And then as we burn them, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, CO2, greenhouse gas, and change the chemistry of the Earth's atmosphere and oceans in ways that will make it difficult for future generations to persist. So can we solve those problems? Well, solving climate change, if we were going to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, requires a near total decarbonization by 2035. That's really soon. So can we do that? The analysis that my colleagues and I have undertaken suggests not. I worked for a year about 5 years ago with David Fridley, who's on the energy analysis team at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. We spent a year researching how the energy transition might fare, what would be the opportunities and constraints. And so a brief summary of that, you can find the entire report called Our Renewable Future online for free. Just go to ourrenewablefuture.org. But the first thing to understand about the energy transition is that solar and wind power, which are the most immediately available, most likely substitute energy sources for fossil fuels, they produce electricity, which is good in a way because electricity is a very versatile energy carrier. But we only use about 20% of our energy currently in the form of electricity. So that other 80%, when you hear about, some company or some country is 100% renewable power, what they're talking about is just electricity. That other 80% typically is ignored because it's going to be much more difficult to address. It's transportation, it's agriculture, it's high heat industrial processes, like making cement. Cement is the key ingredient for concrete, which is literally the foundation of modern industrial society. For buildings, roads, even wind turbines have to be anchored in concrete. So how do we make cement for concrete? In giant cement kilns that operate at 1,500 degrees Celsius, 24/7, 365 days a year. Could we run those things on renewable energy? Well, theoretically, yes, but it would be very expensive, and nobody's trying to do it because it would be so expensive. Kind of the same thing with aviation. Yeah, you might have an electric airplane that carries 15 or maybe even 30 people for 150 miles. But are you going to get 300 people in a plane and fly from San Francisco to Tokyo or Beijing? No, it's physically not possible. So what do we do about these things? What David Fridley and I found in our analysis is that all of these problems can be solved on the desktop, at the laboratory scale. You can use electricity from solar panels to make hydrogen out of water and use the hydrogen, combine it with some carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and make a synthetic fuel for airplanes. It can be done, but it's very expensive. There's no infrastructure for it currently. So is that going to happen by 2035? No, not a chance. And we could go on with instance after instance like that. Similarly, with the materials requirement, it's going to take a lot of stuff to build all of the renewable energy infrastructure, not just the solar panels and wind turbines, but the batteries, the transmission lines, and then all of the technologies involved in electrification, not just electric cars, but electric everything. So again, we found that scale is the biggest hurdle. And further, if we try to replace all of our current energy usage really fast, the energy transition would itself cause a spike in greenhouse gas emissions. Why so? Because it takes energy to build all that stuff. And again, if we're trying to do it really fast, it's problematic. So far, despite rapid growth of solar and wind, global greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase. That's because renewable energy is adding to and not actually displacing energy from fossil fuels. And the main reason for that is economic growth. As the economy grows, we get energy from wherever we can, and we already have all the infrastructure to use fossil fuels. So typically what happens is we use more fossil fuels. Okay, let's zoom back out again for a second. Is global climate change the only issue that's impacting us? By all means, no. It's only one of several survival level dilemmas that humanity is facing this century. And it's important that we see it in that context. A better framework for understanding the human dilemma is Overshoot, where it's a concept from population ecology, where a temporary abundance of a critical resource enables a population to grow larger than can be supported over the long term. And that's exactly what's happened with fossil fuels. So if we're going to solve not just climate change, but all these problems, it's going to require self-limitation. It's not just a matter of changing our technology. We actually have to reduce our energy usage. The same thing with economic inequality, which has been growing along with our physical power for reasons that I'd be happy to unpack later if you're interested. But can we solve economic inequality just by continuing to grow the economy? So, even if some people have small slices of the pie while other people have big slices, well, as long as the whole pie is growing, then even the small slices can grow a little bit. That's the theory of, economic growth as being such a good thing. But if there are limits to the size of the pie itself, then we have to start thinking about those who have the big pieces. They have to get smaller slices, right? The rich people have to give something up. We're only going to be able to get through this century if we are able to limit our power in significant ways. How about the biodiversity crisis? We're going to have to limit land use, set enormous tracts of land and ocean water aside for nature to recover. That means deliberate power self-limitation. Now, there are those who say that can't be done because, evolution works through the maximum power principle. The organism that uses power most efficiently always wins, right? Well, yes, but is that all that's going on? I would argue, no, it's not. That in fact, there's another principle in nature, which I have called the optimal power principle, which adds the dimension of time. And if you look for it in nature, it's everywhere. We have it in our own bodies, homeostasis. Anytime in nature you see a self-reinforcing feedback, that's trouble, and it always ends poorly. Economic growth is a self-reinforcing feedback. Population growth, same way. But there are balancing mechanisms in ecosystems everywhere. Prudent predator theory is based on abundant evidence that predators evolve not to kill all the prey they possibly can, because they'd wipe out all the prey and the predators would just disappear. No, they've evolved to limit their predation so that it's a stable system. Same thing happened with indigenous societies. human beings, because we were so powerful, we just fanned out across the planet tens of thousands of years ago. And everywhere we went, when we encountered an ecosystem that was unfamiliar, we killed as much as we could for food. And the first Pacific Islanders killed the very last members of 1,000 different bird species. So, you know, the biodiversity crisis isn't new. It's been going on for a while. But the big point is, when people stayed in one place for a long time, whether it was the Aboriginal Australians or Africans or Native Americans, when they stayed in one place for a long time, through a series of hard lessons, they learned the rules of the game. They learned the limits of those ecosystems. And so they developed behaviors, institutionalized behaviors, for limiting their own taking of those resources. We still do the same thing in the modern world. We limit power in all kinds of ways, financial regulations, environmental regulations, so on and so on. If we're going to make it through this century, we're going to have to limit ourselves in all of these ways, and probably more. But these are, you know, really significant ones. And we've made some efforts in all of these areas so far, but nowhere near as big as the efforts that we will need in order to survive. So if we can limit power, why aren't we doing it sufficiently? I mean, all the warning signs are flashing red ever since, you know, limits to growth came out in 1972. We've had report after report showing, you know, if we don't limit this thing much more than we're doing now, it's going to be catastrophe later on. But we're not doing it. Why not? Well, I think the main reason is just we've gotten this colonial mentality. It's become a Star Trek mentality. So now, you know, we even have this idea that humanity is destined to take over more and more cosmic habitat. And it's our destiny, it's our duty, in fact, as human beings, to do this. And it's just projecting the colonial mindset out into the universe. And what's really convinced us that we can do this is fossil fuels, because we're able to do so many more things, so much more effectively, so quickly, you know, whether it was transportation or food production or manufacturing, you name it. Over the last few decades, our ability to do these things has expanded so quickly that we got it into our minds that there are no limits. And Ronald Reagan even said that in one of his famous speeches. There are no limits to human ingenuity, so there are no limits to growth. Well, there are limits to human ingenuity, and there certainly are limits to growth, and we're bumping up against them right now. So what's the future actually going to look like? The idea of a big unraveling or a great unraveling is, we at Post Carbon Institute use that framing as well as the work that reconnects. I think that's a perfectly good framing for what we're facing. And there's a spectrum of possibilities over the next few decades, from collective self-annihilation to sufficient self-restraint. There's no third option of, you know, just continuing to grow and we invent some new energy source, or, you know, nuclear fusion happens and suddenly there are no limits anymore. No, take that off the table. Don't even think about it. There are two options: collective self-annihilation or sufficient self-restraint. So what to do in the situation? Fight vertical power with more horizontal power. We need more cooperative alliances among folks who get at least part of the picture that I've been painting. We need vast ecosystem protection and restoration efforts. Indigenous people should be our teachers in all of this, because they still retain some of that cultural wisdom about limits. We need to build resilience throughout our communities and our social systems around the things that matter most and build trust by living with wisdom, integrity, courage, and compassion. And I say build community resilience around the things that matter most. Well, let's start with food. Food, everybody's interested in food. It's a way of getting people involved in activities together. Over the years, I found efforts at building food system resilience are the kinds of resilience building efforts that tend to succeed, tend to get more people's interest and cooperation and efforts going. So it's a place to start. It's certainly not all that needs to be done, but we have to start somewhere. And building that kind of resilience in our local communities is really important, because it's the people in your community who will be your lifeline as things start to unravel and fall apart. So I'll sort of end where I began, with wisdom. Knowing others is intelligence, knowing yourself is wisdom, mastering others is strength, mastering yourself is true power. This is not new. We've known this for a very long time, but it's a lesson that we need to relearn fast. So that's my presentation, and look forward to our conversation about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Wow, that was a very big summary of your book. Thank you for that. And I want to revisit the first three questions that you presented at the beginning. One was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, one was that how humans have become so powerful. It's important for us to understand that, because we cannot correct a problem if we don't understand the roots of why that happened or how that happened. The second was the many ways that we have developed dynamics or tools to oppress each other, basically, and to utilize each other and the environment. So it's not just in a good way, but also in an oppressive and abusive way, which always touches limits when we do that. We stretch that too much. And the third question was, can we change this relationship that we have with power? And I think that that's the most important piece of this presentation right now is, if we can change that relationship. I want to revisit the two scenarios that you mentioned, because they relate very well with what we call the three stories of our time. We do have a third story, but that we know that third story is going nowhere, which is the business as usual. And it's the story that is in the newspapers and in the media, and everybody keeps repeating that, like there is a way out, and there is continuous growth. The thing here is that both the Great Unraveling and the Great Turning, both of them are actually happening at the same time. And they are also happening in different ways for different peoples around the world. So there are some people who have been more impacted by the Great Unraveling or the Big Unraveling story, for a long time. So it's not new for them. You touched a little bit in your presentation about, the different effort, and you talk about rich people having to limit their power more. I would like to clarify, because when we hear the word rich people, we may tend to say, well, it's not me, I'm not rich. Right? So that creates, that feeds the denial, or the fantasy that we are doing okay and everybody else needs to change. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I remember that in your book you actually mentioned the change that needs to happen. So rich people, we're talking about middle class people and people from what we call the developed countries, which is not developed in that way. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Right. Well, those of us who live in the United States and Canada use energy at about twice the rate of people who live in Europe, who in turn use energy at about 5 times the rate as people in Africa. So that gives you some sense of the spectrum. It's not sustainable. It's not possible over the long term for people in any society to use energy at the rate that people in the US and Canada do. It's not sustainable. Whether it's through solar panels or excuse me, or coal power plants, it doesn't. I'm not going to say it doesn't matter. It does matter, but neither one is sustainable over the long term. So those of us who live in North America, I think it's really important that we look at our lifestyle and what if we're concerned about carbon emissions, for example, what's our energy usage? How much energy are we actually using? And what are the implications of that? Where is the energy going? Not many people are energy literate in that way, but it's really important that we get more so. Now, of course, Europe has been going through an energy crisis over the last few months as a result of the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And so a lot of folks in Europe are having to become much more energy conscious and energy literate than they were previously. But ultimately, I think the best way of getting through an energy crisis like that is some form of rationing. And in fact, if we were intelligent, if we were going to choose the path of least suffering going forward with regard to climate change and all of these other pressing issues, rationing would play a huge role, because what's rationing about? It's apportioning resources fairly and deliberately, okay, rather than just who can pay the most. That's price rationing. It's quota rationing, okay, and we have a long history of that. First World War, Second World War, many countries around the world, and even in the United States, we still have food stamps, which is a form of food rationing, actually. So energy rationing would be a good thing to start now, rather than waiting until the crisis is upon us. But that's how we should be thinking about our consumption. We should be thinking about how to ratchet down from a level that currently is unsustainable. Now, if for those who do live in Africa or certain countries in Central America or South Asia, where per capita consumption is very, very low, it's a different metric, and it's a different kind of strategy. But we also need to be thinking about population growth too. That's something that's controversial in some quarters, but population and consumption are together parts of what is creating the crisis that we're facing.
Thank you, Richard. And now that you talk about rationing, there's another topic that you talk about in your book that is very related to that, and it's a paradox, or more than a paradox. It's psychologically what happened when I am told that I need to do what is perceived as a sacrifice, as having less, and then I start looking at my neighbors and well, but they are not doing that. And I don't remember the name of the paradox. You name that in the book, but that is very, very real.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that has worked in those times that you mentioned, the rationing during the First and the Second War, was because there was something very specific in front of the people, very, right there, that people will see as the enemy or the challenge.
Right.
So the call to do a sacrifice was built on patriotism and, and other values. In this case, we're facing different crises, some of them that are not touching equally, everybody.
Mhm.
So how do you, how have you seen a movement, have you seen an approach that actually takes people from the mindset of sacrifice into something that feels different? I personally think that if we paint that not as a sacrifice or as rationing,
Right.
but we paint that as, all the good things that we're going to be able to do or be, there will be more response from people. But I'm interested in your research and, have you seen that, Dom?
Yes, you're absolutely right in everything you said. It's a huge challenge. In rationing during the world wars, we had lots of social cohesion. War tends to create more social cohesion. It's pretty reliable throughout human history. It's one of the reasons that wars led to the development of more complex societies. Well, we don't want to have a war to create social cohesion. We won't, but we need the social cohesion in order to get through this very difficult set of circumstances ahead of us. So again, if we were up to it, what we would be doing is educating everybody in the society about the nature of these crises, where they came from, how they're interconnected, how they relate to our own behavior, our own expectations, and so on. And then we would figure out together how to ratchet down our consumption, our land use, and so on. Of course, that's not happening because our leaders are pushing us in exactly the opposite direction. And why is that? There's a section in my book on the psychology of social power, the social psychology of power. And it turns out that there's been a lot of very clever research on this done just in the last 10 years. People with a lot of social power tend to have reduced empathy. They tend to have less of a sense of an ability to see things through other people's eyes and appreciate what other people are going through. So, who do we put in, the people we put in charge of society, by the very fact of our putting them in charge of so much, gives them a lot of social power. So their sense of empathy tends to kind of drain away, just as part of the job of being CEO or whatever. So we're looking for our leaders to solve problems like climate change, biodiversity crisis, and so on. And in some ways, they're the least likely people to be able to even understand these problems, much less address them. This is one of the reasons that I think, even though we're able to articulate ways that whereby society could get through this daunting time, the reality is it's going to be a daunting time. Things are going to fall apart, and it will be an unraveling, regardless of what we do. Now, one of those things that we could do if we were an enlightened society is shift from measuring GDP and insisting on the continual growth of GDP to measuring people's happiness. What makes a good life? What makes people satisfied? What makes a community cohesive? And measure those things and make those the main goals of economic policy. And there are lots of ecological economists who have been advising that for years and years. And again, that's what we would do if we were smart. Unfortunately, the way social power has arranged itself in the world makes it very, very difficult for that to happen. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't push for it.
Thank you. And there's another thing that came to my mind when you were mentioning about the leaders and the importance of educating people, and is that we know that the future is bioregional. Mm-hmm. So we won't be able to support globalization anymore. So it's going to be crumbling quite soon because of the many limits to the power that you mentioned before. So, but that's a paradox as well, because in order to do this, we actually need to work at the same time. Like we can work locally, but we have to also coordinate with other countries and other places in the world. There's another thing that you mentioned that from my own experience is also a challenge, and is the trend of urbanization.
Right.
So we have about 56, I think, percentage of people are living in cities right now. And the trend says that probably by 2050, 70% of the people, in the world will be living in cities. However, cities that are not fully regenerative, they're not fully sustainable. But in cities is where you have more diversity, more opportunity to act in a community or in a communal way. So how do you solve that paradox of we need to go local, but there is the global aspect that needs to happen, otherwise we all fall together.
Right.
We need to grow our own food, but we live in cities and there's not enough land. You even mentioned that we need to set aside some land to recover. There is not enough land or resources or capacity for every single person to go to the land, to buy land, or to live in an eco-village. So how do we do that?
Yeah, it's not an easy problem to solve. The globalization of awareness will remain possible as long as we continue to have the sorts of electronic tools by which we are speaking to one another right now. And I think these tools they're communication technologies. Remember, I said communication technologies are a tool of social power. And social media, for example, certainly are tools of social power. So they definitely have their downside. They empower and enrich, small groups of people, the tech industry, and so on. Won't go into that right now. But nevertheless, they make it possible to maintain a global awareness of not only the problems, but also potential strategies and ways of expressing empathy, which is really important, across distance, across space. That said, the trend of urbanization is one that has a shelf life. No trend goes on forever in nature in one direction without hitting a boundary at some point. And whether that boundary is the extinction of the species or just the reversal of the trend. I think in this case, the trend of urbanization will hit a boundary, probably not human extinction, although human extinction is possible this century. It's one of the possibilities, but I think urbanization will reverse itself before we get to that. Hopefully we won't. And it will likely do so as a result of food crisis. This is not something I'm prescribing, I'm saying is a good thing, but nevertheless, localization as a response to our situation could be a good thing. And there are a number of ecological thinkers who have been proposing it for some time. I would point to Helena Norberg Hodge as a big global advocate for localization. And her organization has been working on this for decades and pointing out the advantages of local communities, local solutions to problems, and so on. Also, one of the board members of my organization, Post Carbon Institute, Jason Bradford, has written a piece which you can find on our Post Carbon Institute website, postcarbon.org. And it's called "The Future is Rural." He's a PhD evolutionary biologist, but he's also an organic farmer. And so he has really powerful insights about this question we're discussing right now. And rather than me going on for much longer, I would recommend, if you're interested in this, read Jason's paper, The Future is Local, or The Future is Rural, excuse me.
Thank you, Richard. I think we're clear on those. I'm just pointing the paradoxes, and the challenges that we have ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are at the top of the hour, so we're gonna get 5 minutes of bio breaks for everybody. And when we come back, you will have all the opportunity to ask questions to Richard. I suggest that you don't put the questions on the chat yet, because there will be so many that I won't be able to capture all of them. You can raise your hand using technology. When you see the reactions piece on the bottom of your screen, there is one option to raise your hand there. So let's take a break, 5 minutes break. And wherever you are in the world, take those 5 minutes, and we are going to come back and we'll be receiving the questions. Thank you.
Everyone. I just wanted to note that we are recording clearly, and we will be following up with an email within 48 hours after this gathering with resources and the recording. So you'll be able to watch it again.
Thank you, Frida. Yeah, so welcome back, everybody. Let's do some stretching if you haven't done that. It's not good to be sitting that much, in front of the computer. Great. Okay, and I have been reading some of the comments. Yes, we expect, that those of you who offer some kind of education, that's one of the things that Richard mentioned. The more awareness that we provide to people and to communities, the better. And we will start with a round of questions. I see Alkis. Is that how you pronounce your name? Great. So go ahead, Alkis.
Wow, thank you so much. It's quite interesting to observe this this lecture with all the familiar information, and also with repeating and the manifestation in this group. So thank you so much, Richard, and everybody who is here watching. What came to mind, many things were said and quite general, but what came to mind with the proposals that were being mentioned so far is the generalized lack of trust in the centralized decision-making institutions that we are kind of suffering collectively from right now, which makes it very hard for any kind of application of a proposal. Many proposals would be there, but it makes it very hard to make such an application. Implementation, actually, is a word. Mm-hmm. And what I'm thinking about it into feeling and giving solutions, trying solutions myself on a local level. I'm curious if, and I wrote it down not to forget, if since, yeah, if a decentralized, let me phrase it this way, if we could consider developing and implementing technologies for collective decision making, mm-hmm. If that kind of could be a tool for resilience, since this is also the theme of this, is not per se how do we go out of this, but how do we go through this? I don't know, I'm curious if you've thought about it, and if you would like to share something about this process of decision making.
Sure. There are a lot of people who've been doing sort of cutting edge work on tools of democracy and forms of democracy. Essentially, what they're exploring is how we could have more decentralized social power, more horizontal social power. And this is all really good stuff. So there are things that could be implemented, for example, in the U.S. system of democracy that would improve the outcomes in terms of the decisions of the government actually reflecting the priorities of the people. But there are so many dimensions to this. One of them is information. You know, unless people have good, reliable, and clear information about what's happening, it's impossible, even if they're empowered to make decisions, it's impossible for them to do so. So, I mean, this is why I devote my time to what I do, trying to help inform people about what's going on in a bigger picture sense, is so that collectively, you know, humanity has just an incremental tiny bit more awareness of what's really going on, so that our decisions will be incrementally better. And so there, you know, those are two big aspects of the dilemma that you pointed out, the sense of the process of decision making and the information that informs the decisions, regardless of what process is used. So we need to work on both of those, and that can happen at all levels, from the local to the global.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Alkis, for that
so much.
question. Yeah, very important question. And I was going to say there are many resources out there to educate yourself and educate communities about different ways to make decisions in community. And I encourage you to explore those. We will definitely send a lot of resources after this webinar. Thank you. I see Catherine. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you both for this interesting listening. I have a concern that the strategy we are having now almost all over the world of jumping into all electric may lead to dramatic consequences that we are not really aware of. And my question is, how do you think we could slow that down, and what do we do to replace that strategy?
Yeah, I think the strategy is self-limiting. The push toward electrification is, you know, it's gathering steam, certainly, and there are mining companies that mine lithium and copper and all of these materials that will be needed. They're licking their chops because they want to get in on this action. And but the reality is that the resources are limited and the budgets are limited for the actual implementation of building of all of this new infrastructure. So in a certain sense, I think it's self-limiting. I personally don't want to be seen as discouraging renewable energy entirely, because we were just talking about how we need the globalization of awareness via this kind of technology that we're using now. If the grid goes down entirely and permanently, then billions of people die and we lose all kinds of cultural riches. Everything has been digitized over the last 20 or 30 years. Human aspects of human culture, from music to information about ancient artifacts and our knowledge of previous human societies, and all of the studies that have been done that have been put onto servers somewhere, our knowledge of the human body and how it works, our knowledge of nature, of other planets. These are hard-won cultural riches that deserve to be passed on to future generations. Now, of course, we've also created a lot of cultural dreck, TV soap opera episodes that no future generation needs to even be aware of, and football games and everything else. But nevertheless, we have to keep some kind of grid going if we're going to avert a complete cultural collapse. And if we're going to keep a grid going on some level, we're going to need some renewable energy to do that. So the ideal situation from my perspective would be to power down society very significantly so that we end up using, maybe in North America, maybe 1/10 as much energy as we currently are on a per capita basis. But we use that energy obviously for the necessities like growing food and distributing and so on, but also to maintain a slimmed down grid that can maintain communication and information storage that will maintain our cultural achievements for future generations. That would be the best outcome if we can manage it. So renewable energy will be somewhat self-limiting, and it does have downsides, no question about it. The mining, the electrical fields. Some people are very concerned about the impacts of electrical fields on biological systems and so on. All of that is certainly food for concern. But at the end of the day, I think we've gotten ourselves into a situation where we actually need to maintain a grid at some level.
May I add one thing? I didn't want to be understood as I was against renewable energy. That was not my point. Was just do not get. How about the Bitcoin energy usage that is incredibly high now, and how do we combat that, fight that?
Yeah, well, fortunately, it's doing a pretty good job of fighting itself. I think the cryptocurrency world has taken a beating in the last few months, and well deserved. It's pointless. It has no reason for existing, and so yeah. Hopefully that one will go away on its own.
Thank you, Catherine, for those important questions, and thank you, Richard, about talking about the grid and certain type of grid and technology. And I'm thinking all the ramifications of just disappearing in the grid, all the things that are keeping human beings and things working right now. So it's huge. Okay, let's go to the next person, Zen.
Thanks. Thank you. And thank you, Richard. This has been just beautiful thinking and really useful. A question that I have is, have you found analysis of how to reverse the trend toward totalitarianism, the push by those in power to have even more control through inciting violence and ripping through the bonds of social cohesion?
Yeah, I wish I had a good, easy answer for that. I think it's really, really important. There have been some reversals of that trend just in the last couple of years. The election in Brazil, I think, was really significant from that standpoint. Again, good information is really key, and the totalitarianism tends to feed on information control. So the free flow of accurate information is the best medicine for maintaining non-totalitarian democratic states where they exist. But at the same time, I think we have to be realistic about the fact that democracy can't always solve problems. when a society is faced with so many converging crises, as we will be over the next few decades, a majority of people in many societies may choose to do foolish things rather than face difficult truths. Democracy is not a solution for everything, but if we're going to at least try to solve some of these problems, then a free flow of accurate information is essential to doing so.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Sam. We have Lloyd Hansen.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate your presentation very much. The focus has been primarily on the technological aspect of energy and power. And I see it as kind of one of the liberal myths that all we need is adequate information and people will see the light and will be going in the right direction. But study after study that I've read of shows that it's beliefs, worldviews, consciousness that really determines the direction that a power goes. And that beliefs are predicate. We believe things, we find things that are to be true because we believe them, not the other way around, that we believe them because they've been demonstrated to be true. And some aspects that haven't been touched on here, and again, I realize it's personal with me, but I believe without a recognition and support for the sacred, that there's no way that a society can address these issues. And I believe that without a spiritual component, which is what liberalism is a completely materialistic philosophy. And without a spiritual component, there is no recognition of the greater whole and the interdependence of all of us. Comment, please.
Right. Well, where does wisdom come from? It must come from an awareness of the limits of the self. You know, that we are part of something that we can't control, and awareness of mortality can be a step in that direction, rather than denial of mortality. In a way, the craze for limitless growth is a denial of mortality on a grand scale. And it's only the sense of balance that comes from the awareness of limits that can lead one to have wisdom in life. And that's what we need. If you call that spirituality, great. I don't know that it's you know, what words can we use? I think different traditions have different words, whether they think of themselves, whether they think of it as religion or spirituality or philosophy. It has to come back to an awareness of limits and concern for the well-being of others within this amazing banquet of existence whose price of admission is mortality.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Lloyd. I think that that's a very big component because it can inspire people. And actually, you speak about that in your book when you mention how the voluntary limit to power has gone through history in many different ways. And one of those is through storytelling that comes from religion.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, we have another question from B. You're muted, B. You can unmute yourself.
I do myself. Okay. Brilliant talk. You said that one of the things that happens before society is going to fall apart is income inequality, or one of the signs that it's falling apart. And you said that power corrupts, and also that only about 20% of the consumption of energy is controlled by the individual. I don't know if I read that right, but most of the big consumptions, we don't have control over that.
Right.
That's industry, and that's by these people who are slowly being corrupted. And I feel like because of the political situation in America, so we don't want to be divisive, but you got to tax the rich, and income inequality is always on the last. It's always last. A politician will do all this civil rights and then income inequality. And I just think it should be first. I think that's, I don't think anything's going to get done until we start making our own decisions and not having the people with a lot of money do it. And I know that's considered political, but I don't think it's political. I think it's scientific. So.
Well, I would agree with you there. The folks who've been doing sociological research using statistics and data come to essentially the same conclusion. I would point to Peter Turchin, who's written several really important books in the last few years on this, and he's with his colleagues. He has an extensive network of colleagues who've assembled this database called SESHAT, SESHAT, and it's a database of quantifiable information about human societies through history. So they're able to analyze that database using computers, of course, for all different variables. And what they come out, one thing they've come out with it very clearly from this study is that high levels of wealth inequality lead to social instability. Complex societies are like a wealth pump, constantly pumping wealth up to the top of the economic pyramid. It's just the way they're structured. It's the way money works. So unless the society has ways of spreading that wealth back down and through the levels of the pyramid that are really functional, then the society will tend to collapse because people just don't want to invest the effort in keeping it going. It's not fair. Why should they bother?
Yeah.
So over time, what happens is the people at the top of the economic pyramid set the rules. Because they have the power, they set the rules. And in setting the rules, they tend to favor the wealth pump over the redistributive apparatus. And so wealth tends to get even more concentrated, and then the society falls apart. And typically when the society, in the stage when the society is about to fall apart, you start to see more competition among elites and overproduction of elites, elite aspirants. And this is where you get political division, polarization. It's standard stuff. It happens all the time historically. And so we see this happening now in the United States, for example. We shouldn't be surprised. This is entirely predictable, given the fact that we've been increasing the level of wealth inequality over the past several decades, particularly since the 1950s. We should expect to see more division, more political division, more elite fracturing, and more dysfunction. So we've got to turn that around, and the place to start is with distribution of wealth. As you said.
One quick question:
Yeah.
Has any country ever turned itself around before it went under?
Usually it's a crisis that turns countries around. And I would recommend to you a book called let me get it.
You're out of focus.
I know, I'm trying to get the camera to focus on it. It's not
Put it in your
focusing on
face.
it. Maybe
Put it
there.
over your face.
Front.
No. There we go. There we go. The Great Leveler.
Great Leveler.
By Walter Scheidel. He's an economic historian, and it's a big book, as you can see. And so he analyzes a lot of data, and he finds that typically countries only turn themselves around as a result of confrontation with one of the four horsemen, he calls them, of basically environmental collapse, revolution, financial collapse. I forget what the fourth one is, but you get the idea. Typically it's, or war, that's the fourth one. So, for example, in the 20th century, the two world wars, World War I, World War II, were the big economic levelers. And it's during and immediately after those awful events, wealth inequality declined very dramatically. So in the 1950s, for example, that's when we see U.S. income taxes, very, very progressive, people at the top of the income spectrum getting taxed 90%. Yeah.
How do you spell Turchin?
Turchin.
Thank you.
Thank you, B, for your question. Thank you, Richard. And that, that kind of reminds me something that you mentioned in your book, which is the adaptive cycle. And where in that adaptive cycle we are right now, that we are probably in the conservation phase where, some elites actually try to preserve what it benefits them. And that is usually right before, the release phase, which is the collapse. And that's based on resilience concepts and the ecosystem. So going back to questions, and somebody asked if we are going to be sharing. Yes, we are going to be sharing this recording, and there will be a cafe where you are all invited to actually discuss these things. It's going to be on the 11th of February without Richard, but Richard obviously is invited to come if you want to come. But it will be more like a relaxed cafe to discuss resilience at the local level. So we go now with Spiral Journey. Spiral Journey, I don't know who the beautiful people from Spiral Journey you are, because I don't see your face or your name. Go ahead. Oh, Molly. Okay, go ahead, Molly.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize I still had Spiral Journey up there. Hi, Richard. I've followed you for a long time. I've been reading your new newsletter since it was in paper.
Wonderful. So, good for you. Thank you.
Yeah. The question about solar, I hear different things, and I'm hearing from you that, putting solar on your house may not be the good thing to do because of all the energy that goes into making the panels and the rare metals and the mining and the et cetera, et cetera. And so and I realize we can't just do it on an individual level. We have to do it on a social level, but nevertheless, one tries to say, well, what can I do in my life? Obviously limit use of electricity as much as possible, and certainly I already do that. So just what is your advice about solar at this point for the individual?
You can do the analysis for yourself and come up with your own answer. My wife and I have had solar photovoltaic panels for 25 years. And that's long enough to see the first set become antiques. And just this year, we replaced them with a new set that was much cheaper and more efficient. And we donated the old set, which were still working, to a useful cause. But we also have solar hot water. We have electric heat pump for heating and cooling the house. We have solar cookers, solar food dryer. Insulation. I could go on and on, but we have tried to experiment with these technologies for electrification, for renewable energy. We drive an electric car, and I think that's given me some sort of first-person insight into the technologies themselves, and also into what we don't control. We can control our energy usage at one level, but at another level we can't. Like we didn't build our own electric car out of raw materials. We didn't make the glass for our solar cooker. we can only control so much. But I think it's a good idea to control as much as you can, so you get an idea of what goes into it and what's involved, and you can have more agency. So for people who own their own homes and have the opportunity to do so, I say, yeah, sure. Go solar and do it consciously and do the math.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. We have Robin.
Hi, thanks, Richard. It's very interesting. I teach environmental science at the high school level. I guess my question is, it's about, clearly we need technologies transition. I'm just most curious about humanity's capacity for, I just wonder what where your faith lies, what you think about our capacity to move, especially those in the haves, realm, from denial and resistance, and head in the sand, to humility and, the psycho-spiritual aspects of our ability to change. Do you know what I'm saying? The moral aspect, the moral part of it. How do we do that short of, creating a third world war just so we can be more humble? I mean, like, what do you think about that?
Yeah. I think people are complicated, and when we get in really big groups, we can be very, very nasty. Particularly big groups that are characterized by a lot of vertical social power, which most big groups are. In smaller groups, we can be nasty too. I mean, certainly you can find lots of examples of small groups doing all kinds of nefarious things. But if we're left to ourselves in smaller groups with less, physical power at our fingertips, we can learn to be more or less sociable. I'm kind of, I'm pretty pessimistic about human beings as a species on many levels, but at the same time, we are capable of pretty amazing things sometimes. The arts, music, architecture, visual art, gardening, we can make beautiful things. We also know how to be amazingly generous and have great concern for one another's well-being in the right circumstances. So how do you set up a community to promote those pro-social aspects of human beings and discourage the antisocial aspects, I guess you'd say? And of course, philosophers have been worrying about that for a very long time. But we've already talked about a lot of the variables, including wealth inequality and good information and localism rather than large scale of decision making. So I realize I'm kind of repeating myself at this point, but these are big kind of general questions, and I kind of end up in the same place.
True. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin. That's a very beautiful and big and complex question. But in my experience, I have seen that communities, they show up, after disasters, after collapses, after wars, after so many things, they show up and then change things. So I think we had to trust that is going to continue to be that way.
Could I just say one thing more? When you were asking your question, I had one thought that I didn't actually get around to verbalizing. And that's exactly what you were just saying, Sylvia. In the wake of natural disasters and other big challenges, we sometimes can really come into our own. I live in Santa Rosa, California, north of San Francisco, up in wine country. We had big fires, wildfires, just a few years ago. And I'm not going to tell you my whole war story from that, but just point out that it was our neighbors who saved us, and people we didn't even know that well, but they were going up and down the street, banging on people's doors saying, hey, look what's coming our way, get out. And we did. And during the following 10 days, when there was no electrical power, no natural gas, we were just everybody was kind of on their own, people who had survived in our neighborhood. And neighbors got together and raided each other's fridges. And before all the food spoiled, we cooked it all up into stews and shared it. And it was really quite a remarkable communal moment. Despite the destruction and loss of property and some loss of life that occurred during that period of time, I actually look back on that as a kind of shining moment in our community.
Can I just add one other thing? Just real quick. What helps me is an addiction analogy, sorry, that, the characteristics of addiction are denial and repetition and self-harm and the whole deal. And the solution is spiritual. And to me, it works as an analogy. I mean, how dark it is before the dawn kind of thing. So
right.
I guess the 20th century is our addictive moment. The 21st, I'm hoping, is our spiritual humility moment that I hope lasts.
Me too.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Richard. So we have time for a couple more questions, and then we're going to start closing. Heather, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm going to repeat something that was just said because I was about to say it, but it looks like Richard already jumped on it. I was in Santa Rosa too during that time. And I'm curious because I know you talked about, war bringing, people together in those situations. And we're seeing these increases in disasters in communities across the globe, across this country. And then what looks like it's also fueling an adaptation movement at the same time. And so I'm wondering kind of your thoughts on kind of whether the disaster piece may be bringing communities together and what your thoughts on the adaptation movement that's also kind of coming to the forefront at the same time as a movement, not so much as the technical pieces of whether it's going to, whether we can adapt out of this and so on and so forth, but like as a movement piece societally.
I think you're exactly right. We're seeing that in lots of places, and even in some unlikely places in red states that are seeing environmental crises that are more or less directly linkable to climate change. You find people pulling together and taking stances on energy issues that may be at odds with what they formerly thought. These kinds of crises offer opportunities for communities to build new alliances and to come together and to create community organizations. And so if you're the kind of person who likes to do that kind of work, get ready, because the demand will be huge, and we're already seeing it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Richard. We have Tommy.
Thank you for this. This has been very inspiring and grounding. This part of the morning together. And I just ask you, Richard, I work with leaders who are often talking about being systems thinkers, and referencing different books, but they're talking about the system that they work in, their work system. And I'm wondering what conversation we should be, supporting, inspiring leaders to be having a conversation with. They're together in meetings 50% of their time. So what other conversation could they be having that may be helpful to the world?
Oh, boy. I'm struggling a little bit to answer this one, partly because you started talking about systems, and I'm such a big advocate of systems thinking, as promoted by Donella Meadows and her community of systems theorists. And if you don't have her book, Thinking in Systems, by all means get it. It's kind of a Bible on this subject. People who learn how to think in systems look for stocks, flows, boundaries, and feedbacks. And once you really understand systems and you see self-reinforcing feedbacks within a system, you regard that as a problem, as an alarming situation that needs to be dealt with. You don't look at it as, oh, isn't this great? Which is what we've been doing with economic growth. So we need more true systems thinkers. Sometimes the word gets bandied around by people who think they know something about systems, but actually don't even know the basics of how systems function. Mm-hmm. So, if for these people who are leaders, a real education in systems thinking and resilience thinking, the adaptive cycle that Sylvia was talking about earlier, these are concepts that can be extremely helpful in understanding what's really happening, as opposed to, we have too many people who are just looking at dollar signs and abstract, signals that aren't telling us how we're really doing.
Helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tammy. And I posted a few resources for systems thinking, and we are going to have actually a webinar on systems thinking for
Great.
Systemic change in a month, I think. Okay, so we are getting to the end, and I wanted to share a few things and ask Richard to share some of the things that we can do. In the Work That Reconnects, we talk about the 3 dimensions of the great turning and how those 3 dimensions are complementary. And those are the dimensions some of you who are here may be already familiar. Holding actions, which is basically stopping the harm. A shift in consciousness, which is helping, like Richard was saying, with education and awareness, and also exploring different ways, alternative ways to see in the world that are more regenerative. And the third one is the guiding structures, which is basically building models for how the world could be, how society could be in the future. And then I think that those of you who are here is because you have already that curiosity, or have already started in one of those 3 areas, or all of them together. And I would like to see from Richard, what kind of suggestions do you have for all of us? I mean, I remember that in the book you mentioned a few things for young people, but I think those are applicable for everybody. So if you can go ahead with those, that will be great.
Yeah, first of all, I think that's a terrific framing to use, and Joanna Macy has been one of my mentors, I guess is the right word, for many, many years. So you all are already clued in to I think the best ways of thinking and responding that I've come across. And what I guess I just suggest, if you're not aware of what we do at Post Carbon Institute, we try to provide some useful information and ways of framing that can help in that second category of, consciousness, exploring different ways and so on. So our website, resilience.org, is a terrific resource. It's updated on a daily basis with articles from around the world on everything from eco-villages to the latest analysis of renewable energy costs and so on. So some of it's wonky, some of it's spiritual. Then I've done a series called Think Resilience. It's a series of 22 short videos that is intended for sort of the educational environment, for helping students understand not just climate change, but the context of climate change. All the things that we were talking about earlier: economic inequality, loss of biodiversity, resource depletion, pollution apart from carbon pollution, and how all these things are related, and why resilience, building community resilience, is a useful response to those things. So the Think Resilience webinar or video series is a useful tool. And other than that, being in communities like this one, this is a virtual community, I know, but communities of relationship where we can process together what's happening and what's its meaning and what can we do. I think that's super important. So you're already doing it. And I'm delighted and honored to be able to contribute to it.
Thank you, Richard. And I have posted some of the resources. There are questions here if we are going to be sharing those. Yes, we will be getting some of the resources that you share in the chat and share those with everybody who attended and everybody who registered and didn't attend. I want to invite you all. We will have a cafe. Cafes are a little bit different from webinars, because in webinars, some of you may have the chance to ask questions, but it's more a presentation than a discussion. In the cafe is completely participative, and we usually create small groups for people to discuss about all these topics, and we will have that on the 11th of February. So those of you who have attended and those of you who will be watching the recording and want to come to those discussions, we are inviting you. You're welcome to attend. We will also have a webinar with a person who is specialist in systems thinking. So hopefully you will have the opportunity to explore those concepts as well.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about the Work That Reconnects networks, webinars, and Conversation Cafe series, please visit our website at workthatreconnects.org. We welcome you to become a community member of the Work That Reconnects network. Visit workthatreconnects.org community member registration for more information.